This is a PowerPoint presentation on special education laws in America. This is an overview of a timeline of laws and decisions. My name is Matt Dahmer. I'm attending UW Superior in the master's program of educational administration. My PowerPoint presentation is on the history of special education law and court rulings in the United States. My research intended to locate and highlight landmark Supreme Court cases and laws that forever impacted special education and educating people with disabilities. Throughout my research, I discovered that people with disabilities were essentially barred from public education until the mid-1970s when the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, was passed. Up to that point in history, the disabled had two choices, to be institutionalized or to be homeschooled. The United States has come a long way in a relatively short period of time when it comes to ensuring that citizens with disabilities are provided with a free, appropriate public education. There are many laws and court precedents currently in writing that protect the rights of all citizens with many different safeguards and procedures. So this all starts back with Brown versus the Board of Education. Many people think of this as a court decision that desegregated schools, but what it really did was it invoked the 14th Amendment, and the 14th Amendment provides equal protection under the law for all American citizens. So this case was originally about race in America, but it started the push towards making sure that all Americans were included in this, including the disabled. Lower court decisions relied on Brown versus Board and determined that students with disabilities could not be excluded from public school because of their disabilities. And as we move forward through our timeline, you'll see this become more of a common theme in court rulings and laws that are passed by the United States government. It took a lot of small steps. Prior to 1961, children in the United States, they weren't publicly educated. That was followed up in 1961 when President Kennedy created the President's Panel on Mental Retardation. Obviously, this term's not used anymore today, but it was at the time, and that's why it's included in this presentation. And this panel recommended including federal aid to all the states. It had over 100 recommendations. Interesting side note here, President Kennedy's forgotten sister, Rosemary, she had cognitive disabilities due to a failed brain surgery. So it's kind of curious that President Kennedy instituted this panel and he had disability within his own family. In 1965, President Johnson signed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. In this picture, you can see him signing that with his elementary school grade teacher. This was part of President Johnson's war on poverty, and this act provided equal access to quality education. It provided funds to primary and secondary education, and this is, again, another landmark time when advocacy groups for people with disabilities really started pushing, saying, hey, you need to let us into public schools too. No longer can we be forgotten. So big changes came about. The Rehabilitation Act, this is a Civil Rights Act in 1973, and especially Section 504. This stated that a person with a disability cannot be excluded or denied benefit from any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance, either public or private. So this made sure that children with disabilities were not discriminated against. This is a much broader law than the future IDEA Act. To qualify for Section 504, the disability must substantially affect major life activities. So if you had a disability that affected manual tasks, walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing, learning, working, you would qualify for 504 protection. And this would look like accommodations in education. It could be more time to complete a task. It could be accommodations for somebody in a wheelchair. Not necessarily always special education, which is yet to come, but just accommodations to make sure that the disabled have equal advantage as everyone else. So finally, the big idea. This is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This is from 1975. It was signed into law by President Gerald Ford. Um, what was previously seen as a privilege is now a legal right, and the basic requirements of the original law remain the hallmarks of special education as we know it today. So the takeaways from this: all children with disabilities must have an individualized education program, an IEP, a free and appropriate public education, and they must be taught in their least restrictive environment. So to qualify for IDEA, it's a little more of a narrow scope than 504. A child would have to be hard of hearing, deaf, speech impaired, visually impaired, blind, emotionally disturbed, orthopedically impaired, autistic, learning disabled, or have a traumatic brain injury. To qualify this, the child would have multiple assessments and evaluations done. There would be an evaluation process with an IEP team and parent input. So we see our first major Supreme Court case challenging IDEA, and in this case there was a girl, I believe, who had received a sign language interpreter at one point, and the school had stopped funding that part of her support or accommodations, and her parents thought that she should have that and made it all the way to the Supreme Court. And ultimately what the court ruled was the school district was doing enough to meet the conditions of her IEP, and she was given those opportunities to learn, and she actually was finding great success. And they ultimately decided that, you know, the idea, the law itself was just there to build a foundation for educational opportunity. It had previously been denied to them, 20 years prior, and that an IEP wasn't something that was going to allow students with disabilities to get affirmative action, something above and beyond all the other students, but more so create somewhat of a equity and level the playing field. So over the years, the idea has been changed. 1997, there were major amendments added to it. As a fourth grade teacher right now, these are things that are very familiar to me, that we see in our elementary school setting all the time. It's usually there where we are seeing students qualify for special education, where you might actually see students leave special education further down the road in middle school and high school. But the goals in special education found within the IEP, they need to be measurable, and they need to be reviewed annually. Something I've definitely been able to take part in during my career. They've increased parent involvement. I know in the IEP process we always have the parents involved. We give them time to speak during the meeting, express goals and concerns for their child. We share those goals with the parents. They'll go home and report cards, or depending on the teacher, monthly or even weekly reports are shared. If the student is not making progress in their IEP, the plan will need to be revised under the amendments to the IDEA in 1997. And as we conclude here, we have some of the more recent changes that have affected special education law. We have President Bush's No Child Left Behind. This was a law that mandated a lot of high-stakes testing. It asked special education students to take these state assessments so that gap reduction could be measured, and just also to have a tracking on them at this level. It also called for more highly qualified teachers, especially in the area of special education. It was kind of, that would be an unfunded mandate of the law. It's kind of hard to force that onto the states at that point. And then we have IDEA 2004. Another buzzword in education is RTI, response to intervention, and this placed an emphasis on it in almost preventing the access, preventing is not the right word, in helping to curb kids away from special education services, early intervention, progress monitoring, so using actual academic interventions in the classroom that the general education population uses, and keeping those minor academic or behavior problems minor before they become major issues. So RTI is, in the behavior side, PBIS, very common practice in many classrooms in America today. So that concludes our overview of special education law and some court cases in America. So hope you're able to learn something from this. And if you would like to take part in any future research, feel free to access my references here. They were very informative and helped me better understand special ed law in America.